Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. We're coming to the end of our series about how to fix democracy, but before we do, we're talking today about a subject that a lot of people have contacted us and asked us to discuss: social media, information, disinformation, where and how we get our news, and what that is doing to our politics. I'm talking to the writer, Sam Friedman, who has written extensively about this subject. We're going to discuss TikTok. We're going to discuss all of the ways in which we may be getting the wrong information. And we're going to ask whether democracy can cope with the media environment we find ourselves in. Sam, I'm going to start with a question which I suppose is a devil's advocate question, although I'm not even sure about that because I'm not sure I know what I think about this. But why does it matter what the quality of the information that people are getting is? And I ask that for a couple of reasons, one of which is it's not clear to me in the history of democracy people have ever had good information. And we're talking about news mainly, but not just news, the ways in which people are informed about what's going on so that they can make choices. There isn't a golden age, I don't think, at any point when the information was good. And then that's sort of a historical point. And then there's a more political sciencey point, which is when there is good information, there's not much evidence that it makes any difference to how people behave politically anyway. And yet, I feel instinctively it must be a problem if the information is getting worse. So why does it matter?
So I think it's true that there's never been a golden age of sort of incredibly well-educated voters who sort of understood all the issues. But the nature of the information people have got has changed dramatically insofar as it's become far more fragmented and differentiated in the way it operates. So you had a period for most of the 20th century, and certainly post-war, where the news sources, certainly in the UK, but in other countries as well, were newspapers, a small number of newspapers, and then a small number of television channels, most of which were either state-run or had some kind of state-level regulation around the content that attempted to make that content broadly neutral and non-partisan, not always successfully, but that was the goal. From the 80s onwards, that starts to change with satellite TV, the end of the fairness doctrine in the US, which I think is absolutely critical in what happens in the US, then the internet and the rise of social media. And so the limited sources of information that people had access to, which were reasonably well regulated to a point, even if that was self-regulation in the case of newspapers, disappears. And then you have this sort of mass of disinformation, misinformation, distraction, noise. And so when people do want to inform themselves, even to a small degree in the run-up to an election or so on, it is now much more difficult to do so in a way that is consistent or even as reliable as it was when the marketplace was much smaller. And I don't want to overestimate how reliable it was. Obviously, paper still made stuff up back then, but it was, I think, materially different to where we are now.
Is the way to think about this that it was actually, there wasn't a golden age, but there was a brief period where the information technology we had and the kind of politics that we have still, which is representative democracy, party-based, electoral, mass communication, representative democracy, those two things were in a reasonably good fit with each other. But as you just suggested, I mean, you started with the 20th century, then you narrowed it to the second half of the 20th century. And actually, I think in the first half of the 20th century, it wasn't a particularly great fit. And it wasn't also a particularly great time for democracy. Those two things went hand in hand too. And actually, maybe it's a briefer window than we're used to, the age of not just newspapers, but television and radio, but regulated in a particular way and serving as transmission technology. That is, it was going out from one to many. There were a variety of sources, but it was in a way a channeled form of communication. And the network age that we're in now, it wasn't a network age in the first half of the 20th century, but it was a lot more chaotic and fragmented. We should probably recognize that the match between the communication technology and the kind of politics that we have, it was brief.
Yes, and that sort of period matched with the sort of wider flowering of internationalism and representative democracy sort of globally as well. I mean, it's an interesting question as to sort of pre-Second World War, when obviously things were much more chaotic and so on. Because you did have newspapers and they were very widely read, and that was the main source of news for people, but you didn't have certainly in the UK, news radio, certainly not television news pre-war. And the BBC radio that did exist, they were very careful about not doing any news. So maybe that was critical as well in this sort of post-war period, having that sort of single voice that most people heard and where most people got the majority of their news from. And that there are corollaries to that in other countries as well. Maybe that was an important part of that effect as well.
And also, there were newspapers in the UK, but thinking particularly of the US, but it was very local. I mean, it was fragmented because there was just a very limited source of news depending on where you were, but it really depended on where you were, what kind of news you were getting. And there wasn't going to be a national picture or a national form of communication. And it was a very fragmentary form of politics. And one of the things that people worry about with our democracy now is that it is fragmenting because the range of sources is becoming so wide. Is the thing that we're living through now a fragmentation problem? Is it a distraction problem? Is it a disinformation problem? Because it seems to me fragmentation and disinformation, probably there are historical parallels, but it may be on a different scale now. I'm completely prepared to believe that. But the distraction, I don't think people were reading their local newspapers, teenagers, for 9 hours a day in order to distract themselves from anything else they might be doing. So if I give you that choice, fragmentation, distraction, disinformation, the current news landscape, which one do you think, well, which one worries you most?
I mean, they're all related, right? So part of the reason that you've got fragmentation is because the forms of media that we have are inherently more polarizing because their aim is entertainment rather than to give you information or news. So to take TikTok as sort of an example of the most rapidly growing social media platform globally, you have this incredibly short window to capture people's attention, 3 seconds to capture people's attention before they flick on to the next video. And that naturally is going to draw you towards content that is more emotive, more gripping, more standout. And that is going to take you more towards content that is polarizing. And it's that content that's going to be successful and then get pushed by the algorithm. So I think fragmentation and distraction are pretty closely linked. And then if you're interested in pushing disinformation, if you're either a foreign agent or a domestic actor who's interested in pushing disinformation, it's quite easy to do through these platforms because of that. But I'm actually a bit less worried about disinformation in a way. I think there are certain situations where that has been very problematic, less so in the UK and US. It's more the shift to news as entertainment and the impact that that has on the way people think about politics that I'm more worried about.
And in a way that relates to what I was saying at the beginning, which is it's not completely clear to me that information is the central currency for good politics, in that a very limited amount of information is probably the norm. But distraction, particularly if it's a new problem, it doesn't feel like a very distracted electorate is a good basis for a healthy democracy. And then there is a kind of fragmentation, which is also potentially problematic and possibly also new. There's a newer quality to the fragmentation now relative to, say, the first half of the 20th century. So I think I probably agree that of those three, maybe it's because I think there's a sort of plus ça change element to the disinformation bit. I used to hate the phrase, we're in a post-truth age or a fake news age, because I wanted to say, well, when were we in the real news truth age? But particularly, say, with TikTok, I mean, I want to ask you whether you think TikTok is a qualitative step change in what we're talking about here. But it does feel like there is something there for which there isn't really a historical parallel.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the sort of amount and quantity of information that people are getting is probably higher than it's been in the past. It's just that the nature of that information is by attempting to be more entertaining and more provocative, drawing people in a more fragmented kind of landscape and reducing loyalty to historic political parties, which was in part based on, depending on how cynical you want to be, a lack of knowledge about what those parties were actually up to, or a belief that they were broadly doing the right thing most of the time. Whereas now, again, because you've got this sort of desire to push provocative, entertaining statements, you get more heavy cynicism and criticism about those parties coming through all the time. I think that's the qualitative difference between what we've had before. It's sort of there's more information, but of a very different nature and quality.
And how much of it has to do with choice? So, in that early 20th century example, the typical voter might be pretty ill informed, I think, but also getting a fragmented kind of news because news was very different depending on where you were. Your access to news sources would vary depending which part of the country you were in, what sort of education level you had, to be honest, in the early story, whether you could read or not. But there wasn't a lot of choice in the sense the misinformation you were getting was the misinformation that was available wherever you happened to be. Whereas now, sometimes the argument is made, the difference is you can choose your misinformation, that we are in a position now where we can seek out the kind of information that seems to fit the view of the world that we want. And that is much easier than it was. And it's become progressively easier even in the last decade or so.
And this is why I say I think the sort of loss of the sort of attempt to have non-partisan media, even when it wasn't always successful, has been so damaging. And I really think you can trace a lot of what happened and has happened in America down to that sort of 1987 decision by the FCC to get rid of the fairness doctrine there. That creates the rise of people like Rush Limbaugh, the talk radio jocks who sort of heavily pushing people towards more right-wing positions. And ultimately leads in 1996 to the creation of Fox News, which becomes a propaganda station for increasingly aggressively right-wing Republicans and then Donald Trump. And here, of course, we still have the BBC, and the BBC is still bound by rules, but the BBC is becoming much less influential. You've seen, even though in theory we still have Ofcom, you've seen news organisations like GB News, Talk TV, etc., start to take the space that Fox News has taken in the US. And YouTube and TikTok aren't regulated at all, so there anything goes. And I think that loss of a single attempted, or in America's case, 3 or 4 attempted non-partisan voices speaking to you, if you're a voter who wants to inform themselves every day, has really changed the nature of polarization.
We did an episode on this podcast with Helen Lewis about the film Network, which is 1976. And part of the reason that film resonates today is that the arguments that are being made, this is the end of everything, this is the death of democracy, they are familiar. And if you just take the word network TV out and replace it with the internet or TikTok or Facebook or whatever it would be from whichever period you're talking about, and yet the complaints, the anxieties feel very familiar, very now. But it's network TV they're talking about. It's Walter Cronkite's world that they're talking about. But the idea was that this was a kind of brainwashing. And I'm really conflicted on this as to whether we're being a bit nostalgic about that world where there were a small number of information sources that if you wanted to inform yourself, you could go to them reliably. And the feeling at the time, at least, which is that this was the end of America in that case, because it was the end of people being able to think for themselves.
I think the way through that conflict is to sort of think, well, it almost doesn't matter whether the information sources were more accurate then than now, although I think they probably were. It's more just that they were within a smaller range of parameters. So from a point of view of polarization and fragmentation, everyone was getting a set of information that, there was left, there was right, but they were within a framework that was familiar. Whereas now it's all over the place and you can get really, really extreme opinions in every direction. Maybe they're more accurate than we were getting back in the 70s, 80s and early 90s, but there certainly is a much bigger range of choice, and that is going to take people inevitably in a more fragmented way.
That regulatory story that you just described in the US, one of the things that's striking about it is it begins before the internet. It's a pre-digital story. So it starts with talk radio. Radio isn't, relatively speaking, an old medium. And then, as you say, it moves on to TV and the creation of Fox TV. And then you talked about the UK analogues to that, which is, say, GB News. It's still a TV story. So the internet is clearly a huge part of this, but if we could strip out the internet and imagine the internet had never been invented, do you think that deregulation was enough in itself, or is it the fact that it happened at the same time that the technology itself was going through this transformation. So it's almost like the two things dragged each other along in their wake.
I think the deregulation is the sort of first part of the story, and even before you get the internet being widely used, is already causing a change in the way that politics works. The style that Roger Alice and the people who set up Fox News brought to that model, which was news as entertainment and to an ideological purpose, has been very influential on the style of people who've then gone on to be successful online. And a lot of people who have been successful online started in that industry. So I think certainly in America, you saw some of that damage happening before the internet came along. And then when the internet comes along, it does so in an environment in which Fox News is thriving and has become the biggest news source on TV in America. And people have learnt this idea of how to make information entertaining and eye-catching in a way that will get subscriptions and views and likes. So it's influential then on the way that social media forms. I think they're two separate developments that then take you in the same direction.
And do you think it's now going back the other way as well? So Fox News shows you how to make news entertainment. That then influences the people who want to build their own platform online. But it now looks, at least to someone just dipping in and out of this, that the main conventional news sources are aping the people who know how to build a platform online. It's a feedback now.
Right, and if you even if you look at the sort of BBC website now, there's a lots of vertical video on the BBC News.
I was literally just thinking of that. I'd been looking at it just before we started talking and thinking, there's too much TikTok on here now.
There's loads of vertical videos, there's loads of lifestyle stories. They don't worry too much anymore about getting their grammar right in on the online stories either. It has become much more, and I don't even know if that, I mean, presumably that's partly intentional, but it also just the people who will be working there now, the younger people working there now, that's what they know of as information and news. So inevitably they're going to be influenced by it in the way that they think about design and content.
There was a story that I was reading about again today. So this week on Have I Got News for You, the BBC had to pull the episode because one of the scriptwriters, in discussing the digital ID card scheme that the government looks like it's going to sign up for, said that one of the beneficiaries would be Ewan Blair, Tony Blair's son. And then it turned out that that isn't true. And the BBC had to pull the programme. But the producer of Have I Got News for You, Jimmy Mulville, gave an interview today in which he said, this is what happens when we start hiring digital natives to be our producers, because they've lost the ability to essentially filter this kind of information. And so this stuff, which was picked up, he said it was picked up on Twitter, X, whatever, got into the show. And it's a pretty serious mistake to make. I don't think you want to be messing with Tony Blair and his family on something like that unless you really know your ground. This does feel like we're a long way from the 1970s and the idea that a newspaper would publish that story without really checking it. But his line was, this is a generational thing. We are now in the Have I Got News for You newsroom, or information scriptwriter's room, hiring people who can't tell the difference in the stuff they pick up online, what needs to be checked and what doesn't.
Yeah, although I saw that and I thought it was a little bit of a cop out because actually, firstly, that you should be checking what your more junior staff are doing, but also I think older people are just as bad, if probably not worse, at identifying stuff like that. I saw the original post on X where they picked this up from, which had, I think, 3 or 4 million views, had been spread very, very widely. And it was being retweeted by, the audience of X is not particularly young. It's middle-aged and being very widely pushed around. In a way, I think digital natives, the younger generation, have a bit more sort of understanding of the fact there will be a lot of misinformation coming through, although they're certainly not immune to it either. So I don't think it's an age problem so much as a information flow problem that we're all affected by.
I also thought it was a bit unfair. It was generationally unfair. But at the same time, the sense I got from it, and this may be bias in favor of my generation, is that as a story, an older person would instinctively know this is not something you want to bandy around unless you're really sure about it. Actually, Tony Blair's son being the person who's going to be making money out of this scheme is a big story if it's true. And it's not the kind of thing that just would be floating around on X. It would have been picked up if it was for real. And it's almost that I think an older generation of news person would just have an instinct for that story, which is it's one we need to check because it's unlikely to be true if it's just appeared in this source. And that does seem different.
That's probably true that, yeah. It probably is true that someone who'd been working in the industry for longer would have thought, but then more senior people would have presumably seen that script and didn't respond to. I have something I call the eyebrow test, which is if anything I read online makes my eyebrows go up, I have to check it because that means it's probably not true. I think everyone needs to learn some kind of trick that means that they don't automatically assume something. Yeah, the more interesting something is, the more likely it is that someone's embellished or just made it up completely.
And is your eyebrow test infallible, or have you yourself fallen foul of this?
It's pretty good. It has failed me on 1 or 2 occasions, but nothing serious and nothing that I've written in any articles as far as I'm aware. It's just useful to have some kind of heuristic to remember that you're gonna see a lot of stuff that maybe, fits with your priors, but then actually, if you think about it for a second, you'd have probably seen it somewhere else if it was true or, it seems a bit good to be true.
And when you say that your eyebrow goes up, you think I need to check it. Where are the places where, when you check it, you feel completely confident it's checked? And is there a kind of, I find there's a middle ground where I think, I've sort of checked this, but actually I'm not even sure that I know that my checking is reliable.
I mean, if it's been widely reported by a lot of mainstream news outlets, I will assume it's true, and I think that's fair to do. I also have individual journalists who I have learnt to trust because I know they're doing their job properly. The real tell is when there's only one source or one place that's reporting something, and it's often not a very reliable source, and or not one that's mainstream. Then that's the tell that you should really need to check.
So I want to pick up on something you just said in passing just now, which is of those videos that are popping up all over the BBC's website, not only are they very short, but you're not even sure they care too much about grammar. And that's another side of this, which is, and it's getting a lot of attention at the moment. You've written about it. James Marriott wrote a widely cited essay on Substack recently about the post-literate society, which is to do with writing and literacy, and the fact that so much of what we are talking about here, and this is a complete difference with the early 20th century, is a visual medium. It's either audio, but increasingly it's not even audio. This is a visual medium, often visual without many words at all, or if there are words, they're not words constructed in the form of grammatical sentences. So again, there's a little part of me that feels I don't want to sound old and grumpy about this. I don't really want to be devil's advocate here because I think I agree with you that it matters. But can we try and say why it matters? So why, leaving aside the things we were talking about earlier, but just on that basic question of the written word versus the other ways in which information or opinion or even emotion can be conveyed, why does it matter that we're moving fairly rapidly beyond the written word?
So when I wrote about it, I went back to Neil Postman's great book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is 40 years old this year, and which he argued very presciently about that this was going to happen in a way that it has. And I think his argument is still the one that works, which is that written English is the best way to make reasoned arguments. Doesn't mean anyone's going to follow that reason or they're necessarily going to use it to make reasoned arguments, but it is the best way to make reasoned arguments if you want to make them. And it forces you, in the process of writing, forces you to think about a reasoned argument. Whereas visual is a primarily entertainment medium, and what you're thinking about there is how to get people's attention. And you don't need to in fact, making a reasoned argument often makes it harder to get people's attention in a visual medium. And that doesn't mean it doesn't have value in itself, because entertainment is valuable in itself. But there's lots of brilliant TV series, films, etc., etc. But when that medium starts to be the one that is the only way that people are getting their information, and entertainment is the primary goal of that information, it fundamentally changes the relationship between news and the audience. And I think that was to a degree true of TV news, and more true of TV news after you saw the end of this sort of fairness doctrine and so on. But it's very, very true of TikTok and the current sort of very short clip videos that are increasingly the way people understand the world.
And do you think, even if we assume that maybe it's easy to overstate the role that reasoned argument plays in democratic politics, there must be a place for it somewhere. If there's no reasoned argument at all, we're in trouble. But actually, it's always been the case that much of what moves people to action and moves people to vote or to have preferences or allegiances is not reason. Nonetheless, certain kinds of political argument are better suited, even if they're not particularly well reasoned, are better suited to the written form. And the visual form does seem to allow for the success of arguments that would struggle if they were written down. I'm trying to find a way of putting it which isn't sort of overstating it.
But I also think it affects the way that leaders and politicians think about what they're doing. So it's not just about the audience, it's also about the person coming up with the content. And I think you can really see this in the deterioration of political speeches over the recent decades. You go back and look at a speech from the 70s, 80s, even 90s. It's written in paragraphs. It makes an argument, might be wrong, it might disagree with it, but it makes an argument. It tries to link up points to support that argument. Look at a speech now from any of the main parties, any party. It's written in single sentence, staccato points, none of which connect to each other, none of which add up to a kind of argument, an overarching argument. They're there so that you can get your 30-second clip for the TV news or for the video that you're going to put out. So it's changed the way political parties need to think about how they even make arguments in the first place. So even if you don't think people ever responded to reasoned arguments, at least the people writing it, it mattered to the people writing it.
When do you think it happened? So you said 70s, 80s, maybe 90s. So I associate this, again, one hesitates to take on the Blair family, but I'm going to anyway. I associate it with Tony Blair. Tony Blair had some very skillful speechwriters, and many of them have gone on to write about the art of speechwriting and the importance of having a real argument, and indeed to criticize later speeches. But I associate Blair, for instance, with the verbalist sentence. So Blair's speeches, I remember being increasingly shocked by his willingness to do that staccato thing in a way that I would say was completely different from Margaret Thatcher, just to take two examples. So that's a decade and a bit apart. And it's also more or less pre-internet. So something was happening there, I think, and I'm not sure exactly what was driving it. The 90s seems to be a key decade in this story. And if it is, this isn't just a story about the internet.
Yeah, and I don't think it is. I mean, although I think if you do go back to Blair's speeches, they are still more written in that kind of style, paragraph style, with an argument in them than what came later. I think the first person to do that kind of one-line speech as Prime Minister was Cameron. And by that point, you do have the internet starting to play a bit more of a role, although it didn't really take off until he was a few years into his prime ministership. And then certainly after Cameron, everyone speaks like that. But yeah, there's a development. Blair was more in that vein than Kinnock had been, and etc. And I think partly because you are starting to get that change in media environment happening before the internet comes in, and they're starting to think more about what's the clip for the 9 o'clock news rather than imagining anyone's actually watching the whole speech.
And it's not just speeches. I was talking to someone who spent an extended period of time, I think it's all available on the BBC now, watching the BBC's overnight coverage of the 1983 general election. And this person said they were just struck by the quality of the argument. So the 83 general election, and it's overnight, so these are politicians, it's raw, and they're pretty distressed, particularly not just the Labour Party, but the people who are most distressed were the SDP, sort of Roy Jenkins and people like that, who discovered their project wasn't going to work. And it was a fraught night in which these people were highly emotional and angry, and very angry with each other on the left. And yet, and it was Robin Day, I think, who was presiding over it, but he said, the person who watched it said, what he was really struck by was just the extended nature of the arguments that they were having. And when I think of recent election night coverage, it's like it's fed into that too. Nothing lasts, in the sense that you think they're going to get into something, but it's just never sustained. It's as though one of the things that has gone is the ability, not just to, because I'm not sure in 83 the arguments were particularly reasoned, but they were sustained. There was a sense in which you could argue this thing out. So it's almost something to do with length as well, or the ability of these things to hold an audience for any period of time.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to get me onto one of my other pet peeves, which is the fact that the BBC sort of design their politics coverage for people who don't watch politics and aren't interested in politics. Like, the only people who are watching election coverage at 2 in the morning are people who are quite obsessed with politics. So why would you design a show that was designed for people who hate politics and gives you no information about anything? I mean, they weren't even showing results properly this time. I can't remember if it was the BBC or ITV, but one of the debate shows that they did, I mean, the awful debates, leaders' debates this time, one of them said, "Can you sum up your sort of position on foreign policy in 30 seconds?" I mean, it was ridiculous and completely meaningless. We don't have anywhere now where senior politicians have sustained long interviews. There is nowhere that that happens. You know, even shows like the Sunday morning ones, they get 5, 10 minutes max. And again, I do think this goes back to sort of seeing politics as being primarily about entertainment rather than about information, and worrying about attention, which for the BBC makes even less sense because in theory, they shouldn't have to worry about that. They should be just worrying about informing people.
And I think it is the case that the market provides a better service. That is, there are places where people who are really interested in politics can get more and better quality information and discussion. I think it just is the case that on election night, you actually get better stuff out of Sky News than you do out of the BBC. And I think that is partly because the market has determined that. They've worked out that the people who are watching at the times where no one else is watching do want more information than the BBC. So this is not all the fault of a market information system. So given these are the problems, and something has changed, something has shifted, it didn't just start with TikTok, and in some ways it's a slow burn story over a few decades, but let's say it starts in the 1990s. What can be done about this? And one of the things that I'm interested in is, and I've been thinking about this a lot in a lot of different contexts, whether if there was in the second half of the 20th century a good fit with the information technology that we had then and the political systems that we were running with that information technology, and it's no longer a good fit. The instinct is to say we've got to refit the technology to the political systems that we have, which I suspect is a losing battle. And my instinct tells me we actually need to refit the political systems that we have to the kind of information technology that exists now if we want those systems to work better. So that's the thing I want to ask you, but it's a sort of slightly pretentious way of asking you what you think we can do about it.
I mean, I think that is what will happen by default. That's what always happens as you move into a different age of technology. You get a different type of politics. That happened with literacy and so on. But I don't think where we're heading with it is a particularly good kind of politics at the moment. It's certainly a much angrier and more volatile form of politics. I don't know what the answer is. The easy answer is to say, well, your mainstream politicians, your people who want to broadly do the right thing, need to find a way to communicate through these mediums. But firstly, that's really difficult for a lot of these politicians. It's impossible to imagine Keir Starmer doing TikTok well, or most people in mainstream politics doing it well. But also, if they do get good at it, it means having to abandon reasoned argument. That's how you get good at it. You could imagine a kind of a more charismatic leader of the Labour Party doing 20-second videos of playing with their cat or whatever and getting followers, even doing 20 seconds of sort of here's our policy on X or Y. But that is still materially different from what we had before. So I'm not sure it gets you anywhere better. It might win you one election, but it doesn't help you build an argument. So how do you find a way with these technologies to find a way back to sort of forcing people to make and structure arguments, whether you agree with them or not? I don't know. I don't know how you do it. So I suppose you certainly aren't going to be able to sort of put everything back the way it was, but I am slightly encouraged by the tail off we've seen in young people using social media just in the last year or so, particularly in Europe and the US. I do think we might be starting to see a bit of a backlash. Not that it's going to mean everyone starts reading books and newspapers, because they're not, but there is a dissatisfaction with this form of information. It is a very poor form of information, and my hope is that it's not a very long-lasting period and we are able to find, and it won't be us, it will be younger people, are able to find a way of using visual media and audio in a way that is more reasoned. And you can sort of see a bit of that with the long form podcast like this one. But the fact that someone like Joe Rogan is wildly popular now, I don't think he's particularly reasoned a lot of the time. But at least he is trying to have sustained conversations with people about ideas and the sort of popularity of that kind of model. So I'm kind of hoping that the 3 second thing dies away a bit over time. If it doesn't, it's very hard to see how that can be used to have a good political information environment.
From what you say, it does sound like you are still assuming that this is going to be a audio or visual information world, that the ship that has sailed is long form writing. For these purposes, I mean, there will always be some people who like it, you and I, for instance, but on the whole, and if particularly if you're talking about a generation that's grown up in a digital landscape, that's not coming back.
It's not, except in that I think it will survive as a medium for a particular group of very highly informed people, and that's quite dangerous in a way. Like, I mean, I think you're going to get much more separation between a group that does still circulate and use and read and write and is therefore much better informed than people who are using the kind of visual audio, certainly the short form visual audio. I mean, there's always obviously been a discrepancy in the level of information that different groups have within society, but it could get really quite extreme.
What are the educational implications of this? I know you work in education too. Should we assume that if we want this to go better, clinging on to the traditional read and then written forms of learning and assessment is clinging on to something which is probably not going to survive, and we should be focused much more on improving the quality of the forms of learning, communication, assessment that fit the information environment that we're in?
Now, I'm not yet ready to give up on reading and writing. I think it is actually really important that schools, because young people aren't getting it so much anywhere else, it's really important more than ever that schools do a lot of work on literacy. And actually, I think it's one of the good things about our education system is that we do push it quite hard still, and we haven't seen the drop off in literacy that other countries have seen in the last decade or so, or at least not to the same degree, although we have seen a drop off in reading longer books.
And by literacy, we mean writing what kinds of things? Are we still talking about essays?
Well, I mean, it's not so much essays at school anymore, but certainly a page or two of writing, and certainly trying to read whole books and whole plays and discuss poems and that kind of thing. I think that it is still important that schools do that because it's not going to happen anywhere else. But I do think, things like media studies, which have been much maligned for a long time as sort of joke subjects, they're really not. They are increasingly important because if you're going to be in a world of this very highly fragmented visual audio media, being able to spot the cues and being able to have heuristics for identifying good information is really important. And you can teach that without being partisan and saying, you should follow these people or follow these people. You can just teach how to pick up cues. And I think that form of education is going to become more important, or should be more important than it currently is within our curriculum.
One of the things that I'm surprised about is that you say that inevitably the politics changes as the technology requires it to change. But it hasn't changed much, actually, over the 30 years. So the ways in which politicians communicate has changed, clearly, and we've talked about that. But the basic political structures haven't changed much, including the basic form of representative democracy. It still has that structure which would have been familiar from 100 years ago. General election is different in lots of ways, but structurally, it's a very similar kind of event. And one of the things about that form of democratic politics, which is one of many ways you could do democracy, is that it's relatively disempowering. It was representative democracy, particularly through the 20th century. It was a kind of trust us, pick your political party, put your trust in that person. You'll get a chance every few years if you're not happy with the way it's going. But it's pretty top down, and it suited a top down information environment. Now we've got this much more networked or even democratic information environment in one sense. There's much more of it and there's much more choice. And yet we're still trying to run that form of democratic politics. So one way that the politics could adapt to the technology is to be less disempowering and more or less let people know that some of it is on them. Give citizens more opportunity to actually shape policy, shape outcomes, so that maybe citizens also came to believe that the kind of information that they were getting mattered. Because it feels like the big gap is between the range of information and the ways in which people are so fully engaged, for better or for worse, and a politics which is basically an analog 20th century top-down mass communication, transmission technology politics.
And then it's true that in developed countries, rich countries, that the structure of politics hasn't changed yet, although the content of politics, I think, has changed a lot as a result of the changes we're talking about and has become much less effective as a result. But if you look at the Gen Z revolutions going on around the world at the moment, that is a change in the way politics works. These are much more fragile democracies, or not even democracies to start with. But if you look at what happened in Nepal, the sort of use of social media by a younger generation to foment a revolution that drove out a government, and then they picked the new prime minister over a Discord conversation. That feels very new. There was a Gen Z revolution that overthrew the government in Bangladesh. In the last couple of weeks, you've had Morocco, Madagascar. It's starting to become a real global phenomenon, and that feels different. We're not there yet in Europe, US, but I think you're right that if you're going to have an inherently more democratic form of information for all of its flaws, that the only way you can sort of combat that is by giving people more power. I mean, I'm generally a big fan of localism anyway. I think our country is far, far too centralised, and that is one of the reasons that people find politics so disengaging. But you can sort of imagine a world in which more decision making was held at local level and thus was able to involve people much more, and that might be an interesting way of doing it before we get to the point where we're having Discord servers choosing our prime minister.
And in a way, the irony is that was sort of the 1990s dream of this technology, that that's the thing that it would enable. And we gave up on it. We didn't give up on it because we never even started with it. It's odd in a way that we've gone 30 years still clinging on to I think it is outmoded form of politics. It really worked well in 1992 or whatever, but it clearly doesn't work particularly well now in this information environment. There are other reasons as well why it might not be working particularly well. But as you said, the form hasn't changed, the content has changed. But the content does not suit the form anymore. It doesn't seem to me that the content is well suited to the form.
And when you sort of see politicians doing interviews on TV with nobody watching anymore and just repeating the same kind of formula. I've been going up and down the country talking to people on their doorsteps. You think, what are you doing? This is so outdated as a way of talking to anybody. Nobody's listening to it anymore. And then you wonder why you're so unpopular. So it is weird that the basic model of communications in politics is so outdated and so dependent on a information infrastructure that doesn't or barely exists anymore. I mean, they're still obsessed with getting front pages of newspapers, which nobody reads, and then informs a BBC News programme which nobody listens to. And you're sort of like, at what point do we realise this has become a kind of cargo cult form of political communication and we move on to where it's really at? But it's partly because politicians are so uncomfortable with the new format because every bit of media training they've ever had has been ignore the question, say your 3 points, get out of the studio unharmed, which is hopeless as a way of communicating on a platform like TikTok and YouTube because people will just immediately flick on to the next video because it's very boring.
If Farage wins the next UK general election, and he does, I believe, still have by far the largest TikTok following of any active politician with Zara Sultana second, will it, do you think, finally persuade them that they're playing the wrong game? And by them, I mean all the others.
On an intellectual level, I think they know, and you can see sort of attempts to try and use these different platforms very ineptly. I just think they really struggle to break out of a historic way of doing things, and it may well need a crisis of that nature for them to bring through a different generation that might be able to, or a different group of people that might be able to do it differently.
What would be the version of Nepalese politics, what's been going on there or what's been going on in Bangladesh? That is a kind of burn it down form of politics. I mean, these are, I think you call them revolutions. And then it ends up with the new prime minister being chosen on Discord. And for some people in the UK, for conventional politicians in the UK, they would say, well, this is the thing we're trying to avoid, right? This is the absurd conclusion of risking tinkering with this system and opening it up to this kind of politics. What would be the version of that kind of new way of doing politics that nonetheless say in an established democracy like Britain, the people who currently run it would recognize it's still within the bounds of what they understand as democracy. So localism is one way it could go. There could be much more accountability and also responsibility for citizens at a local level. But at a national level, if it's not going to be Gen Zers picking the new prime minister on their social media platform of choice, is there a space between what's happening in Nepal and Keir Starmer giving another speech like the one he gave this year next year?
I mean, I think, parties like Reform and the Greens and Zara Sultana, though her attempt to form a party with Jeremy Corbyn has gone pretty badly wrong so far, are finding ways to do that. I think they're doing it in a way that, I mean, one of the ways that they are doing that is by creating very emotive, polarizing content, which is not necessarily what we want. What I don't know, to go back to the answer I gave before, I don't know if there is a way of doing this that doesn't rely on emotive content. In Nepal, a lot of that emotive content was justified. There was a lot of nepotism in the government. Some of the Reform and Greens emotive content is justified. But I don't see any other way of using this form to do national politics. I can kind of see a different way that you could use it to do localized politics, where you actually have physical relationships with people as well as the kind of online content. But it's very hard to see how you do technocratic, centrist, boring politics through a medium that is designed to push attention to the most dramatic content.
They're still doing it to win seats in an election, though. To me, I still get that disconnect. The Green Party now, with its new leader, your party, my party, whatever it's going to be called with Corbyn. Farage is doing this. It's all focused on the next election. And that election will be one of those events which would have been in its form familiar to someone from 100 years ago, though the content would presumably blow their minds, or maybe not, because politics was pretty lively in the 1920s and 1930s. But they're not saying, we're doing all of this new stuff, including all of this emotive stuff. I mean, Corbyn did it a bit when he was leader of the Labour Party, trying to turn it into a movement and trying to take some of it outside Parliament, but that just reminds people of a different politics from the 1970s. But the idea that there might be a way of doing politics which isn't just geared around these electoral cycles and so focused on this very, very narrow form of democracy, which is getting a vote out in a political system which is essentially unreformed. The thing that, I mean, I'm just amazed in a way that these parties are not more interested in doing it differently as well as communicating it differently.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether you need the incentive to change the politics, in that until you have a situation in which winning seats in a general election is less important to achieving your ideological goals, it's inevitable that people are going to focus on doing that. And it may be that in the future that becomes less important because people find other more networked and democratized ways of changing their communities that become more interesting. But at the moment, that is still how you change the world, change the country, would be through having control of Westminster. So I guess that it's hard to see how you could push people away from that incentive.
Even under conditions, so what's happening in France now could be what's going to happen in Britain after the next election. It's a completely plausible scenario that we get a House of Commons where you can't form a government, essentially, which will be one of the consequences of this information age. I think it would, the fragmentation of the political landscape, the thought that you might end up with 250 green, sorry, not green, sorry, again, you might end up with, you never know. Yeah, we'll leave that in. 250 reform MPs and then all of the others in various states of disarray, no one able to form a coalition that could govern or maybe even pass a budget. This is what's happening in France. They can't, the basic requirement, it is the minimal requirement of parliamentary government, which is to pass a budget. That's you can't have a government without it. Might that be enough? I mean, might actual deadlock be the incentive? Or do you think the thing about deadlock is everyone thinks one more heave? And it feels to be what's going on in France, which is everyone is just thinking about the next election. We're in deadlock. So next time we'll unlock it.
And again, you've got the National Rally and the far left have been more effective at using modern communication tools, but they have used them to the same goal. Same in Germany with AfD and Die Linke, they've all been using them to the same goal. So we haven't really seen anyone trying anything particularly different in a developed country yet. I suppose you could argue that the MAGA movement around Trump is something that goes beyond electoral politics in affecting culture more widely. I'm not sure it's a great example to want to use, but I suppose that you have seen a broader cultural movement which goes into religion and so on there. But we haven't really seen anything in Europe that's materially different to what we've seen before. It's just in a more fragmented way.
Yeah, I mean, the MAGA example, if one says, as I occasionally do say, that the way we do democracy doesn't seem to fit the times in which we live, people assume that means you want to abolish elections. It's not about abolishing elections, but it is the case that elections are, in some ways, also because of the ways in which news is reported and news is entertainment, because elections are almost the only entertaining bit of democratic politics, because it's the thing that's closest to sport. And sport is an absolutely booming business in this information environment. Elections are more central than they've ever been. This is the bit that I find hardest to square, which is this technology is making electoral politics feel more and more inadequate as a way of channeling the ideas, feelings, emotions that people have about politics. And at the same time, the fixation on elections, including the fixation on elections as just the way to report about politics. The news cycle in the UK is completely dominated by the thought of the next election, which is 3 years away. Maybe I'm just feeling it because it seems acute at the moment, but that feels more pronounced than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
I mean, it definitely is, and it is part because of this sort of politics as entertainment phenomenon, but it also feeds on itself because the parties aren't making arguments anymore, because they don't know what they want to say, all there is to report is the election, or even though it's 4 years away. If the government doesn't know what its own argument is about what they want the country to look like, and the Conservative Party doesn't know what its own argument is,
Except that it will abolish stamp duty, which is being heralded as a kind of, oh, they've finally revealed themselves moment.
it's just the poverty of reporting at the moment. Because there's no story from any of the parties, you sort of just go round in circles and you end up talking about what's going to happen at the next election endlessly. So everything becomes just so hollowed out that it eats itself. So yeah, I mean, I think it's an absolute demonstration of this problem of entertainment as politics is that if you hollow out all content and there's nothing to it anymore, there's not much to be entertaining about.
So the last thing, it's a question or an observation, and it goes back to what I was just saying a moment ago. But whatever you think about what they may end up standing for, and people are derisive about the name, which is your party, and it's a holding name because apparently they're going to come up with a better one. But behind that is at least the possibility of a thought that, in the absence of the politicians making these arguments, a democracy that really had an interest in its own survival as a democracy would put that back on the people. And in a sense, the way that this democracy needs to reform itself in part if it's going to survive is in this information environment to give people a sense that the arguments that they might make or be willing to make, or find that in trying to make them, they can't persuade anyone of them, are the ones that have some weight in this system, that this is dependent more than it is at the moment on people being willing to stand by the things that they say or the things that they express. And that was the original dream of the internet, in part. It was the original dream of digital technology that would be democratizing in that way. And the technology has moved on in a way that suggests that the people who thought that weren't wrong. And yet it seems as remote now as it did. I mean, it's a joke, the idea that you would put this back to the people and more or less say to them, you clearly are not impressed by anything that the politicians are doing. So you have a go, which is the original idea of democracy. I mean, it's the classic idea of democracy. And there seems to be zero appetite for that, either from the politicians or from the people. And I don't know whether that appetite really isn't there, or maybe no one's asked.
I mean, I think in an age in which we're all kind of scrolling through stuff all the time, the idea of taking responsibility for anything is perhaps more exhausting than ever. And it's a very passive form of engaging with politics, even if it can, I guess, lead to the kind of activism that we've seen with these Gen Z revolutions. It kind of requires the space to do that. And I'm not sure what would give people the space that maybe it just requires things to get so bad, which is often where I come to in these kinds of conversations about democracy from different angles. Maybe it just requires things to break so badly that there is no other choice but to do things differently before people are roused enough to try and find, whether it's the politicians or the people are roused enough to try and find a different way of doing things. It feels like we're heading in that direction. But I don't know what it would take to create that shift. And it doesn't help, of course, that original vision of democratization was one in which the internet was owned by everybody, and now it is, of course, owned by a very small number of companies, many of which have their own agendas and can push particular content and so on and so forth as well. And I don't know how you fix that either. I don't think that is fixable, certainly not with our current legal and regulatory system. So it feels a bit gloomy.
So not with our current legal and regulatory system, but that might be the place where you could see this happening. So that question of how bad does it have to get, it's quite hard to say where the threshold is because none of the thresholds look particularly appealing. But the technology and what it's doing to us getting bad enough that the thought being actually the most important thing for our democracy is to democratize the technology, not in the original 1990s version of it, which is just you've got a computer in your home so you'll be able to sort of express yourself, but actually to give people control over the way that the platforms are run, the way in which the system operates, of which we have, if we're disempowered anywhere, we're completely disempowered there. And that doesn't seem to me impossible, the idea that those two things would come together, the thought that the people who are running this technology are so removed from any forms of accountability or popular control. And the people who are suffering might be willing to do a bit more or to take a bit more of an interest if they felt there was some genuine opportunity to shape their experience. And that's nowhere in our politics at the moment.
No. And there is indeed a kind of fatalism, I guess, about the fact these companies are going to control our lives in the future. And it is difficult because they're much bigger, that certainly than a country of the UK size. In the US, you could do more because they're based in the US and they're very dependent on the US. But if the UK sort of said, well, you have to abide by these regulations, they can say, well, we're not going to operate in the UK anymore, which is what the Nepalese government tried to do in the first place, which is what set off the revolution. India have done it to some degree, but they haven't really created anything else. So you'd kind of need it. I think probably it would need to be a effort that went beyond an individual country to do it. And the EU have sort of pushed back a bit in their very slow, sclerotic EU-ish sort of way, have pushed back a bit on these companies, but again, not enough to drive the sort of change you're talking about.
It seems to me that the historical lesson is there is always something that will reinvigorate a democracy, and it's a war. War is the engine of democratic renewal, and it was ever thus.
World War II led to the greatest flowering of internationalism and democratization of all time, yes. But let's hope we don't have to go through that.
And World War One completely reinvented what people thought was possible democratically and what was owed to the people, and so on and so on.
So great, we're having World War III organised over TikTok.
Sam Friedman writes a really excellent Substack. It's called Comment is Freed. Full disclosure, it is one of the very, very, very few that I actually pay for. It's highly recommended. Next time in Fixing Democracy, the final episode before we answer some of your questions, and by we, I mean David Klemperer and myself will be trying to answer some of the many, many questions we've had about this series. But before that, next time, I'm talking to the historian Aisha Zarakol, not so much about how to fix democracy, as about what democracy is up against. Can democracy cope in the age of strongman politics? That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.